Hello everyone, welcome to the last lecture in our series on political science. You made it, good job. This lecture is going to be on constructivism. Constructivism is the newest of the dominant theories on international relations. And we're going to look at what it means and why in a second. And as with last time, before we continue, what I want you to do is I want you to watch the two videos in the module for this lecture on the Syrian refugee camps. They're linked in the modules. Watch those two first, pause this video, and then come back. Now, just to recap Marxism in international relations, as we said, Marxism in IR focuses on class, and it tries to answer why there is so much wealth inequality in the world. And because Marxists focus on class, and class being an economic term, the metric that Marxists look at when studying IR is also wealth. But ultimately, the conclusion that they come to, unlike liberals, is that wealth is zero-sum. And all collaboration, when it comes to wealth, is inherently asymmetrical. Liberals do not believe that we live in a system of winners and losers. But Marxists look at the world and say, how can you think otherwise? Of course there are winners and losers in the world right now. It is getting better, but that does not change that there are still people who live in the most desperate poverty in the world. Now, Lenin studies imperialism in the early 20th century. And he says that imperialism is not about conquest or prestige, it is about the expansion of markets, because capitalism constantly needs to find new markets to acquire raw materials and new consumers for finished goods. But in modern context, Marxists view the international expansion of markets as not being all that different. In fact, Wallerstein says that the distribution of wealth creates structures of dependence. We are not interdependent, right? So for example, let's take the United States and El Salvador. The United States is not dependent on El Salvador. El Salvador is dependent on the United States, for better or for worse. And because of this, Wallerstein argues that the distribution of wealth creates structures of dependence. And as we said, these are core countries, core periphery countries, periphery core countries, and then periphery countries. Here's the breakdown. You know how this works. You saw the last time. And if you want an evidence, there's a video that you had to watch last time called Panama Papers Explained with Piggy Banks. That is another example of the global elite that Marxists talk about in international relations. Now, before we move on, let's have a conversation about the two videos you were supposed to watch. They're heartbreaking. How did you feel when you watched them? I'm sure sad, angry, disappointed are all adjectives that would describe your state of mind after watching them. But why? That's the thing, right? Why would you feel upset about that? And which theory would explain your being angry about that fact the best? I'm sure that you're not getting angry about the wasted economic potential of bright young children stuck in these refugee camps. I don't think that's what it is. I don't think you're getting upset about the uneven distribution of economic power in these camps. In fact, what you're getting upset at is the idea that children should be in school and not in refugee camps. What you have encountered just now is a norm. Now, a norm is an unwritten rule of behavior that governs the behavior of actors in a given system, right? It's all of the little things. And now norms can be good and norms can be bad. And norms can change because they are not set in stone. They can fluctuate. Until very recently, a norm that existed in American society was that you shouldn't be a Nazi. And then this happened, right? Norms change. Norms are constantly fluctuating. But the question that constructivists try to ask is, How do these norms affect behavior in international relations? So let me give you an example. The Dalai Lama and the Pope. By any other of these theories, these people are not powerful players in the world stage. Right? If you're a realist, you're not particularly worried about the Pope and his Swiss Guard with their striped pantaloons. Like, that's not something that you're particularly concerned about. You are not concerned about the economic prowess of the Dalai Lama in world affairs. Instead, these people are powerful. Why? Well, here are the key assumptions. Constructivism tries to explain, in a post-USSR era, why one of the most powerful countries in the world overnight just decided, what seemed like overnight, decided to just stop doing what it was doing. And it questions the two basic notions that we established in our class so far, the concept of anarchy and the concept of power. Because for constructivists, ironically, these ideas of anarchy and power are defined by norms just as much as the rest of our behavior is. In fact, the most famous line out of constructivism is a line by Alexander Wendt, who says, "Anarchy is what states make of it. The world is what we decide it's going to be." Here's an example of how you can explain this, maybe better. Vladimir Putin is a realist. And so he views the world and current events through that lens. His worldview is not shaped by current events. Current events are shaped by his worldview. Right? So here's what I mean. Vladimir Putin is a realist, and so behaves in such a way that creates lots of great examples for realism. It is not so much that Vladimir Putin looks at the world and says, I guess realism is the right way to go. No, instead he is a realist and he creates current events shaped by that worldview. And in addition, there is no clear way to objectively define what is in our interest, because our interests are subjectively defined. We define what's in our interest. We decide what's important to us and what's not important to us. And that's really important because our interests are malleable and flexible and accessible. It's not something that you can just calculate, put pen and paper, and figure out this is good for me, this is not good for me. Power is multi-dimensional. There's all sorts of different kinds of power. It's not the traditional power that we've seen so far. We've seen compulsory power, setting powers for another actor's behavior, right? Using military, monetary, social means, etc. For example, I can threaten you with war if you don't do what I say. Or I can threaten you with sanctions if you do not do what I say. I'm compelling your behavior. But there's also, say, institutional power. So for example, setting parameters for the whole system, which in turn affects me. So for example, I can petition the United Nations to sign a convention against an issue that I don't like. The Geneva Convention against chemical weapons is institutional power. But then there's sort of structural power, which is my acceptance of the legitimacy of a institution or a structure that in which I operate in, and that has the power to compel my behavior in spite of how I might personally feel about it. So here's the example that I give. After an election, the losing side still has to call the winner Mr. President or Madam President, despite about how they personally may feel about that person, because we accept the legitimacy of the structure of voting. Right? We accept the legitimacy of the process. And because of that, that is compelling my behavior. No individual is compelling my behavior. But the interesting one for constructivists is productive power. The power to persuade people to engage in behavior that I like. This is not simply soft power, it's social power. Things like, say, legitimacy, social capital, prestige affect this. So, for example, the United States spends millions and millions of dollars in foreign aid, such as USAID, because this enhances our legitimacy and credibility. Because then we can go around and put the good guy hat on and say, everybody listen to us because we're the good guys. See, of all the good things that we did? Remember, before I asked how and why the Dalai Lama and the Pope have power, this is why. Because they can get up on their bully pulpit and tell people, hey, this is wrong. Stop doing it. And people will listen. It's why in the 21st century, people, some of the most important people are not, say, activists, and activists are important, but in terms of social power, we talk about influencers, YouTubers, people who can convince you to make a decision based on what they say. That's social power, and in international relations, that's really powerful. So who are the actors in constructivism? Well, advocacy groups. For starters, Doctors Without Borders is a great example of that. UNICEF, stuff like that. Then there's IGOs, international governmental organizations. There's civil society organizations, things like, say, the NAACP. Right? These are groups that believe in civil society and therefore operate in such a manner to make that happen. Then there is these norm entrepreneurs, and this is the important one. These are individuals that push for normative change through the use of their social powers, not necessarily the figureheads or the donors. So think about it this way. Think about individuals going around and using the platforms that they have to talk about civil rights, social rights, all of these sort of things. That's a norm entrepreneur. So where do these norms come from, though? Well, in Finnemore and Sikkink, you sort of have the various stages of norm development. You have norm emergence. Norms that get argued in forums like the UN or domestically, and you have to get states to support these certain norms. So oftentimes these are pushed forward by non-state actors, namely these norm entrepreneurs, and what they do is, quoting from Finnemore and Sikkink, they socialize you in the dynamics of the issue. So let's take a case study. Let's take the example of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar and the genocide happening against them. The norm emergence of this should not be happening starts when people begin discussing the issue in places like Congress or the UN. And they're trying to get states to support something, say a resolution to stop the violence. And you slowly build up support. Eventually, you get to a point where a norm cascade happens. Essentially, you slowly build up support until there is a tipping support, after which the support cascades and the rest of society begins to rapidly support it. There's a very simple psychological reason for this. People don't want to be on the wrong side. They don't. There's this great example that political scientists point to about Nixon and the impeachment. Support for Nixon's impeachment was not particularly there, right? People still stood by Nixon, well into Watergate. They thought it was a non-scandal. But when the tapes came out, and suddenly you had more and more individuals supporting, the idea of impeachment, eventually you got to a point when everybody supported impeachment and no one could remember not supporting impeachment. Because you hit that sort of lofty 50+1, after which it was smooth sailing. It is harder to go from 0% support to 10% support than from 50% support to 60% support because of norm cascading. Then there's norm internalization. After the support is done, the norm is internalized and everyone recognizes that it is valid and they begin to implement it. In norm implementation, they implement the norm into laws and protocols, and it goes from unwritten to written. Because then you create systems to punish those who do not abide by the rules. Norms are important and they are valuable. And this is the newest idea around international relations. So just to recap, we have covered in Unit 2 realism, both classical and structural, liberalism, both classical and structural, Marxism, and constructivism. And here's a breakdown of how that's going to go. And so here's, screenshot this, do whatever you do. I hope this makes sense for you. If you have any questions on course material, you know how to reach me. I may do a recap live stream, depending on if there's interest for that, closer towards the end of Unit 2 exam. Let me know if that's something that you would be interested in. And apart from that, I will hopefully see you guys in another class of mine in the future. Bye-bye.